Hello and welcome to Chapter 37 of the American Pageant for U.S. History class, college level or high school level. We're looking at the Eisenhower era, which is from 1952 until 1960. We have a picture from the 50s here. Actually, this picture's from, I think, 1960, right at the tail end of this. It's in Phoenix, Arizona. You see J.C. Penney's here in the background and all these cool 50s cars, classic cars that we all love here in this country to this day. So let's get into it. Affluence and its anxiety. So after the baby boom, after that post-war, adjustment, you have 25 years of growth in the economy. Home building booms in the 1950s, especially in the suburbia. We talked about the Levitt towns and the white flight in the previous chapters. Coupled with the baby boom, people want their own houses. That being unaffordable because of the prefabrication of them with the suburban Levittown kind of concepts. So home building booms in the 50s. You have the transistor, which was invented in the 1948, which greatly aided electronic booms. Basically, it made everything electronic smaller. Instead of using glass tubes for electronics, the transistor enabled, for instance, people to have pocket radios instead of the big radio set at home that you had to tune in and do all this stuff, and it had dials and all that. You have the first computers. Computers used to be the size of rooms. Initially, they were for military purposes. International business machines were started in 1955, and so this also starts the downsizing of computers to the point that they're this big now, which is pretty crazy. The aerospace industry grew in the 1950s. Commercial airlines really get big in the 1950s. You also have the advent of the jet engine, largely due to German scientists who were brought here after the war to work on the jet engine. Eisenhower started the Strategic Air Command, and he expanded the passenger airline business. Air travel displaced railroads and ocean liners, and it was the way to fly. It was very classy to fly around in an airplane, and so you're supposed to dress up in your Sunday's best if you're going on a flight back then. In 1956, the number of white-collar workers exceeded those blue-collar. White-collar are, professions, service industry. Blue-collar would be laborers. And so for the first time in American history, white-collar workers outnumbered blue-collar by 1956. There were more growing opportunities for work in terms for women. This clashes with the cult of domesticity, which was being portrayed or purveyed through television and movies, which we'll get to in a little bit. This was supported by TV shows. And you get to kind of the birth of the feminist movement with The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, published in 1963. And kind of spurs on the feminist movement of the late 60s, early 70s, which is still ongoing to this date. So Betty Friedan, like I said, it helped launch the modern women's movement. Here's an old computer. This is probably to do some computations that you can do in an instant on your phone. Pretty crazy. This is a typical 50s office, showing a lot of women working in the workplace. So you have men and women, but predominantly women in this picture, kind of showing the changing landscape. This shows the percentage of white-collar workers, how it changed, and 1956 is that year, and then it's still growing into the day. You can see the clerical workers is on the increase, manual labor is on the decrease, farm workers on the decrease, and then service workers is going down as well. This is the percentage of women 16 and over in the labor force. And so you see this big uptick from the start of the war, before the war actually, all the way up to about 1984, 85. And then it kind of slows a little bit, and you get a little bit of a drop around the late 90s to the early 2000s. So the nation becomes a nation on wheels more so than even the 20s. The car made the suburbs possible, whereas cars used to be kind of a luxury item, and then they became essential because of Ford and the assembly line. Instead of just having one car per family, now families had multiple cars. Mom, dad had their own car. Sometimes teenagers would have their own car. They're the ultimate symbol of freedom in the United States. They became a necessity, but especially if you're going to live in the suburbs and you have to drive to work, they're no longer a luxury. You have thousands of miles of highways built during the 1950s. The car culture, symbolized by this picture here, was symbolized by Southern California, and all the things that were California became cool, they became hip, and they were trend-setting for the nation. The car in the 50s led to drive-in movies, drive-in food, drive-through banking, drive-through religious services. You can even get married in a drive-through in Las Vegas and other places like that. We became really a nation on wheels. Cars became flashier and bigger during the decade. After the Sputnik, which we'll get to, the Soviet satellite was launched in 1957, cars started to resemble space rockets, and they had tail fins and, big hoods and things like that. And they reflected that space race that was going on. This is a picture of the original McDonald's. In 1953, Maurice and Richard McDonald redesigned their original hamburger stand in San Bernardino, California, to have their golden arches. This is a picture from 1955. Later on, McDonald's was bought out by Ray Kroc of Chicago, who franchised it and became the first great franchise in American history. This is Cecil B. DeMille's very last film, The Ten Commandments, starring Charlton Heston. Which here's the drive-through, which I guess today with our coronavirus quarantine, this would be a good way to go to the movies. The nation became really a consumer society. More so, a lot of the trends you see in the 1920s are going to continue and accentuate and get deeper in the 1950s. More and more people want to buy stuff. People go on a buying spree. After all the lean years of the Great Depression and rationing through World War II, people had money, they had affluence, and they want to spend money. There was a lot of clever advertising that helped, especially on television. Many of the same trends that commercial radio carried over to commercial television. Disneyland opened in 1955, and then soon Disney had TV stations or TV shows, they're the Disney Hour, and then eventually Disney World opens in 1973. You get the advent of credit cards in this country. The first credit card was called the Diners Club. You could buy stuff in installments. You could also have a charge account, and you don't have to have all the money to buy what you want. You could, buy it and pay for it later. People sought out modern appliances. The modern kitchen was born. They wanted synthetic clothes. They wanted new cars that were flashier, and really was kind of keeping up with the Joneses is where this saying came from. The big purchase that most families wanted to do during the 1950s was television. And it's amazing the advent and how quickly people adopted TV throughout the 1950s. You have fads, cultural things that were sweeping the nation. You have hula hoops, coonskin hats. Pizza became huge in the 50s. Crew cuts, poodle skirts, all the fun things, that people think of when they think of the 1950s. 7 million people bought TVs in 1951 alone. Virtually all Americans had a television by 1960. Popular TV shows at the time, you had the $64,000 Question, which had some questionable things going on, some cheating going on to help some ratings. The Mickey Mouse Club, Howdy Doody, American Bandstand, the big hit I Love Lucy, Leave It to Beaver, Father's Knows Best, The Lone Ranger, and Ozzie and Harriet. You get music. You get the advent of rock and roll, which is a blend of rock, R&B, country, jazz, and gospel, coupled with electric guitars. The big star, the king of rock and roll, was Elvis Presley. Elvis was a white man who sang like an African American, and so this black music became accessible to white teenagers across the country. Many older people were repulsed by it, thought it was lewd and obscene and devil music, and you get the seeds of the first generation gap in this country's history. And so this mass culture, what each generation was consuming in terms of television and music, started to shift between the old and the new, between the old and the young, and so you get a first generation gap. Traditionalists did not like the popularity of Elvis, Marilyn Monroe, James Dean. They were sex symbols. They didn't like some of these other trends that were going on in the country. Sex sold, plain and simple. Playboy launched in 1953 when Hugh Hefner launched his empire by purchasing naked pictures of Marilyn Monroe. Television had differing attitudes between the young and the old. Television was not okay with sex. It was not okay with anything like that, but they were okay with violence. On American TV, there was over 30 westerns, very violent westerns in the 1950s. But I Love Lucy's show, they weren't allowed to say the word pregnant, and they showed everyone having separate beds. In fact, the first couple ever shown in bed together on American television was Fred and Wilma Flintstone in the early 1960s. So some of the side effects of mass culture is conformity, kind of people not having a lot of speaking their own mind, being fearful, and so it kind of leads to this idea that you have to conform and be like everyone else. Really fuels McCarthyism, which we're going to get into here in a little bit. This is a clip from the I Love Lucy show. It's a very famous scene where they're in a chocolate factory. If you get a chance, check it out on YouTube. It is very funny. It's very well done. This is the number of televisions purchased in America, the percentage of homes having TV. You can see just the 1950s hit, and it skyrockets all the way over to almost up to 90%. This is from the I Love Leave It to Beaver show. This is Disneyland opening, which Disneyland's opening was a disaster on the first day. They had a lot of problems. Day 2 wasn't bad, and then after that it continued really well. The Lone Ranger, which is adapted from radio, became a huge TV hit. Elvis Presley, Elvis to Pelvis, the King of Rock and Roll. We have Marilyn Monroe, James Dean. This is a 50s cultural standard video. If you get a chance, look that one up on YouTube. And then here's a 50s pop culture video you can look up on YouTube. They're really well done as well. So Eisenhower, he's the president during all of this. During the election of 1952, Truman is not going to run for re-election. Now, Eisenhower was actually courted by both the Republicans and the Democrats. The World War II general, the hero that defeated the Nazis, who planned D-Day, both sides wanted him. He decided to run for the Republicans, so the Democrats nominate Adlai Stevenson. And like I said, the Republicans nominate Dwight D. Eisenhower. Their running mate, his running mate was Richard Nixon, well known for being pretty strong anti-communist, which satisfies the strong conservative wing of the Republican Party that were very anti-communist. And so Richard Nixon is the running mate. Eisenhower, or Ike as they called him, had a stellar military career. He'd never served in office. He was commander of all Allied forces in World War II in Europe. He made Americans feel secure, and he made Americans feel good. With the Korean War, he said that it should have an early and honorable end. Nixon, good old Richard Nixon, his nickname was Tricky Dick by the media, was accused of taking campaign finances inappropriately, or basically siphoning off money and taking gifts. And so he gave a very famous checkers speech. And it showed the power of television with politics in the 50s. He booked it right after the #1 show at the time, and he gave this speech that basically he's been accused of being dishonesty. It's kind of funny knowing the whole history of Richard Nixon, and that he was a crook and he never did any of these things. He says he's never accepted any campaign gifts. He's never accepted any bribes or anything like that. And the only thing they've ever accepted was their little dog Checkers. And he had the dog on his lap, and by golly, we're going to keep Checkers, and we love our dog. And, I am not a crook. Nixon, all that stuff. Republicans win very easily. Eisenhower wins. His party controls Congress. He's the first Republican president going back all the way to Herbert Hoover. This is an advertisement on television. I like Ike. We'll let you watch just a little bit here.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike.
All right, that's probably enough. That's going to be in your head all day. You can watch the rest if you want on YouTube. Here's Nixon and Eisenhower together there. The electoral map. Eisenhower was the first Republican to win some southern states in a long, long time, especially after the end of Reconstruction. He won Tennessee, Virginia, and Florida. So for Korea, Eisenhower traveled there as the president-elect in December 1952. Through his work, the armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. Eisenhower actually threatened to use nukes on the Chinese to get them to the bargaining table. And what they decided was Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, just as it had begun before June 25th, 1950, when North Korea invaded South Korea. To this day, Korea is still divided along that 38th parallel. And North Korea is still an issue, and it's still a contentious place in the world. And so this war, really, Americans feel like they won because they did liberate South Korea, but it really didn't settle anything. And Korea is still a mess, how many more years later. They do create a demilitarized zone along the 38th parallel. In all, the United States lost 37,000 men. If you look it up online, you'll see some funny numbers. During 1950 to 1953, 54,000 Americans died in the military. 37,000 which died in the Korean War zone. And so how those other 17,000 Americans died, I'm not sure. I never got a good answer on that. But they count all military deaths in those years, even if they weren't in Korea, as the official count. So officially, Americans lost 37,000 in the Korean War, 103,000 wounded. In all, 2 million South and North Koreans were killed, including along with the Chinese. It sent a message to the communists, though, around the world. The United States would fight and shed blood to stop the spread of communism. This is a soldier learning that one of his comrades, one of his friends was killed in battle, and he's being consoled here. This is the Korean War Memorial. Not as famous as the Vietnam War Memorial, but it's in the same area near the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Highly recommend if you go to D.C. to go check it out. Oh, Joseph McCarthy. From 1950 to 1954, Senator McCarthy of Wisconsin was arguably the most powerful man in the United States. He alleged in 1950 that he had a piece of paper with 250 people on it, that they worked for the State Department, that their names are on this list. They were communists. They were communists in American government. Now, naturally, you're probably thinking, okay, what would be your first question? Who's on the list? Well, that's for me to know. Are you wondering? Are you suspicious? Maybe you're on the list. Maybe you're one of these communists. And so it's really, there's no proof. It's just this giant witch hunt. And what he does is he attacks the Democrats to gain control politically. Most of the people that were accused of being communists were Democrats, and it ruined their political career. They were investigated. There were loyalty oaths. There was things where books were banned across this country. And it's really just a bunch of lies to just create fear and panic in this country. He accused officials. He held Senate hearings for the next 4 years. And really, if McCarthy accused a person of being a communist, their career, their lives were over. His downfall was when he accused the army and the military of having communists in their ranks. People watched by the millions on TV and saw that he was just really a cruel bully that had no proof, that really had nothing behind what he was saying. It was just a hall of mirrors, as we would say. They saw him as a cruel bully with no proof. In December 1954, Congress formally censured him for his lies and for his work, and so he actually died 3 years later of alcoholism. He used to brag that he drank a fifth of whiskey a day. And so McCarthy, it led to people being blackballed from Hollywood, books being banned, all because of this communist Red Scare, this witch hunt, which was just a terrible time in this country. There he is, Senator McCarthy. There's video of him if you want to check it out online. This is about, there's a good TED Talk about it, actually. Our last section here, desegregating American society. Jim Crow laws dictated every aspect of African American lives in the South. I mean, in living and death, everything was dictated, that they were separated, and this was all legal. African Americans were unequal socially, politically, and economically. The violence in World War II kind of spurred things into action. The Double V movement during the war, the planned march on Washington by A. Philip Randolph that was called off because FDR gave in to their demands, and African Americans being treated as equals in Europe, led to a lot of Americans, wanting more rights and equality in the South, especially. You have Jackie Robinson during the war, who refused to give up his bus seat and was arrested in the South because he didn't give it up to a white officer seat. You have the Double V movement fighting for victory abroad and victory at home. German POWs, prisoners of war in the South, were treated better than African Americans. German POWs were allowed to go to white theaters and blacks weren't. And then A. Philip Randolph and his planned march on Washington. In 1946, 6 servicemen were lynched in Mississippi, which kind of shocked the nation. And then the one that really kind of spurred things to get going was the brutal murder of a 14-year-old named Emmet Till in 1955. Allegedly, he would get a cat call at a white woman. It was not true. He was drugged from his aunt's and uncle's home, beaten to death, drugged behind a car, and thrown in a river. He was so badly mutilated, the only way they could identify him was his father's ring. His mother insisted that the pictures of Emmet Till were published so the public could see what happened to her boy. And so those pictures, that story, really sparked people to act. Many civil rights leaders said, you know what, when I saw those pictures, I knew I needed to do something. You have Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. President Truman desegregated the armed forces in 1948. This was a recommendation from the Committee on Civil Rights in 1947. Some of the examples of Jim Crow laws, when you look at how deeply segregated the South was, these are just preposterous. White nurses were not allowed to help black men in Alabama. Bus stations had to have separate ticket windows and separate waiting areas in Alabama. Blacks and whites could not play pool together in Alabama. Separate toilet facilities were required in Alabama. There's more in other ones, but Alabama had a bunch of them. Interracial marriage and cohabitation, that's living together, was illegal in most southern states. In fact, it was illegal in many northern ones, including Colorado for a long time. Prisons, juvenile detention, delinquent centers, mental hospitals, restaurants, hotels, libraries, movie theaters, parks, telephone booths, even cemeteries in most of the South were segregated in some manner. Black barbers in Georgia were not allowed to cut white women's hair. Textbooks from a white school could not be given to a black school if they were done with them, and vice versa in North Carolina. Teachers were fined for teaching integrated classes in Oklahoma. And then in Huntsville, Alabama, the city council passed a resolution that made it unlawful for whites and blacks to play cards, dice, dominoes, checkers, pool, billiards, softball, basketball, baseball, football, golf, and track together. It also applied to swimming pools and beaches. Wow. So here's some pictures, some colored waiting rooms, no beer. It wasn't just African Americans and whites in Oklahoma. No beer was sold to Indians. You have the white and black or colored drinking fountains here. We have Jackie Robinson here when he was in the service. You have Jackie Robinson playing baseball, Hall of Fame baseball player. A. Philip Randolph, one of the early pioneers of the civil rights movement. This is the Emmet Till. This is what he looked like before and after. This is graphic. The men were acquitted in 67 minutes by an all-white jury. Very sad, tragic chapter in American history. Eisenhower believed in a gradualism approach, meaning that it will happen eventually. He believed that the Cold War and communism and McCarthyism was more important than civil rights. Until the Cold War and McCarthyism overshadows it, until McCarthy goes away in 1954. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is really the legal arm of the civil rights movement. One of the big misconceptions is it's just this big movement together. There's many different branches of it, which we'll go over. But the legal arm, the one that took litigation, that took people to court to advance civil rights, was the NAACP. In 1944, in Smith versus Allwright, the case ruled that Democrats had to open one of their primaries to African Americans. This was in Texas. They won in Sweat versus Painter in 1950, which banned separate professional schools for blacks and whites. And then the big one you've probably learned about is the Montgomery Bus Boycott. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat and was arrested. You probably heard a story that she was tired or she was out shopping or working, just refused because she was didn't want to move because she was exhausted. Turns out she used to work for the NAACP. She went to the Highlander Folk School, which trained people how to protest. This was planned. It was coordinated. She's a former, like I said, secretary of the NAACP and attended the Highlander Folk School, which was a school in Tennessee that taught people how to protest. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. attended it. And so because of this, it spawns a movement. African Americans in Montgomery boycott the buses in response. 75% of the customers of the buses were African Americans. And so their idea is if you want to change something, you attack them where it hurts, the wallet. This whole thing was led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other reverends and pastors in the South. People did everything to get around. They walked, they carpooled. King was arrested, and many others for his work during this. And the Supreme Court finally ruled in favor of the bus boycott, or basically of the boycott, and buses were integrated in December 1956. It was a whole year to get this change, just for the right to sit on the bus together. This is a picture of Rosa Parks being arrested on the left and on the top, and then the Highlander Folk School, which was accused of being a communist training school, was a protesting school. Here's Dr. King in his mugshot. The bus boycotters walking to work here. And then this is a museum there, and this is the bus seat, and you have President Obama sitting there, kind of commemorating, showing how far African Americans had come. We're going to stop there. It was a lot today. Hopefully you learned something. If you have any questions, let me know.